Welcome to the lecture Marginalisation and HIV/AIDS. This lecture was developed originally by Associate Professor Sharon Burns from the School of Public Health and Health Promotion. She was one of the 3 people who designed this unit, and today I'm delivering the lecture. I'm going to cover the concept of marginalisation, which is key for the next 2 modules. In this context, I'm looking at deviance, difference in social norms, stigma, discrimination, and social exclusion. And from this, the effect of stigma on health. Then I'm going to relate the concept of stigma to HIV/AIDS, looking at the context of Australia, the United States, and Asia. So what do we mean by marginalised? Well, one definition for it is the social process of being made marginal, being separated from the rest of society, forced to occupy the fringes, not considered to be the center of things, or having a lower social standing. When you think about a piece of paper, of course, the margins are the outside, so you're away from the information, away from knowledge, away from where things are happening. Marginalisation refers to equity and inequity in disbursement of resources, food, housing, and wealth, access to services, programs, and policies. When it comes to the social determinants of health, marginalised people do not have good access. So to health services, housing, it depends on the particular group, but the idea is that they are marginalised from key social determinants. What I'd like to emphasize, and will be emphasizing over the next 2 modules, is that marginalised people have worse health than those who are in the center of the action, so to speak, and that poor health is a result of marginalisation, so it works both ways. Now, norms, social norms, are ideas that tell us how we should behave, tell us how society should be operating. So we're in the realms of should. So a number of norms define, let's say, what women should be like and what men should be like, or how people should act. And there's a strong social pressure within society to conform to whatever set of norms are current at the time. And then when people don't conform to those norms, there are various social ways to punish them, or to mark them out, or to try to bring them back in to operate the way they should be operating. There always have been guiding principles in society and expectations about how people ought to behave. So you don't need to differentiate between these norms in terms of the unit, but it's useful to understand prescriptive norms. Think about prescribing in a prescription from the pharmacy, defining what people must or must not do. So you write it out. Here's what you have to do. Prescriptive is the one, defining what people should do. So the first proscriptive is must. This is a set of rules that cannot be broken. Prescriptive then is encouraging what people should do. Popular norms are what most people actually do. Social norms are socially accepted behaviors, and cultural norms are influenced by culture. Now, what is interesting is that sometimes what people say they do, or what they should do, or what they tell other people they should do, is different from what people actually do. And if you cast your mind back to the 2nd lecture on anthropology and health, I talked about participant observation. This is a technique that anthropologists engage in when conducting research. So you participate in activities at the same time as you observe yourself and others undertaking these activities. And the reason why participant observation provides a rich source of data is that often what people say they do is not the same as what they do. So people may say, for example, yes, I have a very healthy diet, great diet. And when they're asked to keep a food diary of what they actually eat during the week, even they can be quite surprised that perhaps their diet wasn't as good as they thought it was. Sometimes there are contradictions between these different categories of norms, and one example of this is alcohol consumption. Legally, you're not allowed to drink a certain amount and then drive a car or operate other machinery. There's rules about serving alcohol, about what type of alcohol, how strong it is, about adults drinking alcohol and not children, so there's an age restriction, which would be proscriptive norms, what you must or must not do, and that's supported by the legal system. On the other hand, social norms in Australian society, it's very acceptable to drink alcohol. In fact, it's encouraged. And I've heard from people, migrants to Australia, who don't drink alcohol. They sometimes find it difficult because other people don't understand that stance. And it can make it awkward in social gatherings where people feel uncomfortable drinking alcohol if others are not drinking alcohol. And you could talk to an alcoholic who has stopped drinking to hear their perspective of what it's like as well to abstain when other people are imbibing. So there's pressure here, pressure to drink, or pressure to be a part of a group of people who are relaxing and drinking together. So there's a conflict sometimes as well between messages given to young people about alcohol and yet the proscriptive and the prescriptive norms regarding alcohol. Now what we need to mention is that social norms as being rules or standards that guide or constrain individuals' actions and behavior. Social norms are a mechanism of social control. It's a way to reinforce these behaviors and try to get rid of those behaviors. And there's pressure on people to conform to those norms. If you don't conform, people can feel threatened or excluded, marginalized, judged, discriminated against, coerced. So this is a mechanism of social control. And so now we need to look at what happens then when people do not conform to accepted social norms. Deviance, these are definitions from the reading in your text. Deviance is defined as behavior that transgresses social expectations and is likely to attract sanctions from other members of society. You may think of sanctions in the global context as refusing to trade with Iraq, for example. At one point, that was a UN decision. For individuals, sanctions could be excluding them, not interacting with them, withdrawing support, social, financial, etc. Difference, used when an individual possesses characteristics that are dissimilar to or they behave differently from the majority of people within society. Now, difference in itself is a fact, but where we get into marginalization is when people think that the other, and often it's written in capitals, the other is too different or so different that you think there needs to be a separation. You distinguish very carefully between us and them, self and other. And with that, you judge the other negatively. So it's a form of ethnocentrism. You may want to go back to lecture 2 to remember what ethnocentrism is. Once we've labeled someone as the other, as a deviant, as being too different, then a set of behaviors follow from that judgment. And one of them is stigma. Stigma is an attribute or characteristic that separates people from one another. It is used by individuals to interpret specific attributes of others as discreditable or unworthy, and this results in the stigmatized person becoming devalued. So stigmatization then is the process of stigmatizing a person. So you're marking them out, almost like putting paint on them, to say you're not worthy, you're different, you're weird, you're unacceptable, you're dirty, a number of negative judgments, and you are devaluing the person. You are setting yourself apart and setting yourself above. Discrimination is the idea that someone is of less value and should be excluded from social networks and the benefits of society. So now you're acting on the stigma and you are making sure, either deliberately or through omission, that those people do not have access to your social goods or your social networks, the good things in life. This is a form of social exclusion, the exclusion of individuals from the social networks and resources because of their different and stigmatized status. Stigma is socially constructed and is attributable to cultural, social, historical, and situational factors. One of the 10 points of the Imagining Health Toolkit is that reality is constructed, socially constructed. We create these categories. We create the category of who is acceptable and who is not acceptable, who is better, who is not better, who is same, who is different. And they change according to context. And again, you may want to go back and look at the lecture on culture to talk about the fact that culture is internally diverse. It changes through time. It is related to language, and you can certainly see how we use language to reinforce or create stigma. This is the case because it stems from values, attitudes, beliefs, norms, and morals, and these are culturally informed. Historically, there have been a number of health issues that have been stigmatized. For example, leprosy. There's an image there of the person. Lepers had to ring a bell to warn people that they were coming by. They were isolated from society, often on small islands. For example, there was one off Venice, an island there, and in a number of different places. They were shunned. People were scared of them. They didn't want to touch them. And lepers had a really difficult time meeting their needs because society had isolated them and rejected them. Another example was TB. TB, often called consumption because you were consumed by the disease because of the extreme weight loss. It was a major contributor to death, mortality, and morbidity. For example, in England in 1814, TB accounted for 1 in every 4 deaths. And again, so people with TB were isolated, and today what we have is antibiotic-resistant TB. And we deal with that in a very similar way that we used to. In fact, there's an island off New York City where people with antibiotic-resistant TB are isolated until they are deemed safe to be among the public. But there's less stigma about TB today. It is seen as an infectious disease. It is treatable. We understand more about it. But historically, people were very scared about catching TB. The disease wasn't understood. And people were stigmatized for having it. Mental illness is still stigmatized, and there have been public health campaigns to change this, but in many societies around the world, people are afraid to admit that they suffer from a mental illness. And I find that there's not enough information and encouragement of people to have good mental health. We don't talk enough about what it means to have good mental health. And in my tutorials, certainly I'm continuously emphasizing to students to look after themselves while they're studying, including, yes, eating, exercise, sleep, looking after their bodies, but also hanging out with friends, having a social support network to make sure that you are looked after during your studies and in life itself. Obesity is increasingly stigmatized, and there's a lot of victim blaming with obesity. There are many causes of obesity, and we are getting to the point, I think, now where overweight and obese people are being targeted and stigmatized by society. And HIV/AIDS, which is the focus of this lecture. What's interesting, I said that stigmatization is culturally determined, it's socially constructed, it is situated in context, and so it changes over time. So some examples, babies born out of wedlock. In Europe, historically, they were called bastards. They were not able to inherit. They were treated as socially inferior. They were marginalized and stigmatized. Today, I would say there is a continuation of some of that social pressure, but there is far less emphasis, and people are often don't know and are not positioned socially because of their birth. It used to be said it was on the wrong side of the blanket. That was the term. Sex before marriage, depending on where you are situated, this is either going to result in stigmatization, or it is not thought to be anyone's business and not an important issue. De facto relationships is another. Women wearing trousers. 200 years ago, it was unheard of that a woman would go out in public in Europe wearing trousers. And in fact, even in the 40s and 50s in North America, this continued to be an issue. It was expected that women would wear skirts. And so people would be treated badly if they appeared, women would be treated badly if they appeared in public wearing trousers. Other stigmatized issues continue today. Abortion is not talked about because people are afraid they would be judged, stigmatized, marginalized if they had had an abortion. Rape of women continues. In many places of the world, if a woman is raped, she is then stigmatized. She is soiled, no longer pure, no longer has honor, and she is rejected, marginalized, sometimes completely kicked out of the family unit. And I think, in fact, abortion and rape are two health issues that people are still reluctant to talk about openly. Other changes, though, are interesting. High alcohol consumption, smoking. bottle or breastfeeding. These are issues that have changed from place to place and over time in terms of the degree of stigmatization for the people that engage in these activities. So the result of this, of course, is the cycle of prejudice that I spoke about first in lecture 2. Because of the stereotyping and judging as people as others, as different, as less than us, then you act out of these prejudices, and that becomes discrimination, where you actively exclude people from social goods. Often stigma and the discrimination resulting from it is created and perpetuated by the dominant group in society in order to reinforce its own values, attitudes, and social norms. The victims, of course, are those who are said to be different, who do not conform to the notions of right behavior as defined by the dominant social group. What is the effect of stigma on health? Well, at its extreme form, it's genocide. People decide that another group of people is so unacceptable, so low, in fact, sometimes so unhuman, that the only way to deal with it is to get rid of them. And we've seen genocide and ethnic cleansing throughout history, and in fact in the last 2 decades in various parts of the world as well. Physical violence, bullying, exclusion, gossip, verbal abuse, blaming, rejecting by friends and family. These are all ways that people act on stigmatization, to stigmatize other people. The result of this is people who are stigmatized have reduced access to the social determinants of health, and if they already have health issues, this is made worse. Stigma can intensify the sense that life is uncertain, dangerous, and hazardous. And you can imagine, of course, the result of that for mental, psychological, emotional, spiritual health, let alone physical. So let's look at HIV/AIDS. I hope you are aware what HIV/AIDS is. HIV refers to the human immunodeficiency virus, and AIDS refers to the acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. The acquired, of course, means it is not inherited. This is a disease that is transmitted. And syndrome refers to a cluster of diseases. What basically happens with this is that your immune system becomes compromised, reduced, your body is unable to fight off other diseases or conditions, and so you get a cluster of health problems that your body has to deal with, and it's got a reduced capacity to deal with them. Transmission of HIV is through sex, blood, mixing blood, either through transfusions, the sharing of needles or syringes, and through